worked out in Malibu for a hyperlocal publication. And in June, I started with Report for America, which is an initiative through Ground Truth. So through that initiative, I got a job at the Ventura County Star. So I'm an education reporter right now.
I'm Sonia. I went to BU about a year after Shivani, so 2014 to 2018. I currently work at the Washington Post, but I write about pop culture, so I'm not covering politics, even though I live in DC. I am from Chicago area, where I am right now. I'm from the suburbs, but I normally, like I said, I live in DC. Yeah, and I've always covered pop culture, so kind of stayed constant with that.
Yeah, and we have the same moderators as last time. I'm Angela Yang. I'm current editor-in-chief of The Free, and Cami.
Hi, I'm Cami. I was multimedia editor in the fall of 2019, and right now I'm completing a fellowship with Business Insider.
Yeah, so to start off, we know that you guys were both editors at The Free, holding various different positions. How did you guys know that you wanted to join The Free? When did you develop that kind of interest in journalism?
So I joined my freshman year kind of as blog. I didn't want too big of a commitment, so I started there for a few semesters, and then I had an interest in Photoshop and stuff. I was self-taught, so I think she was multimedia editor or something like that at the time. I kind of transitioned with her, and then I was associate layout editor, so that was working on the layout of the newspaper. And then fall 2016 is when I became layout editor. That was my last semester on The Free, last semester in college actually, but yeah, so that culminated my experience. And I guess I didn't explain why, but it was just something I wanted to do. It was the independent newspaper on campus, and I wanted that experience, not only for myself, but also to work with a group of student journalists. I feel like I learned a lot from the people I was surrounded with.
Yeah, I think for me, it was kind of like a combination of curiosity and just like chance, honestly. I went to, at BU, they have like Splash, so like the events fair thing. I think that might be where I heard about The Free. It was either that or just because I was in the communication school, but hadn't declared a major. And so like they tell you about FREEP if you're interested in journalism in any amount of, and so I'd heard about it, and I joined kind of like Shivani. I didn't like run in like I want to do this for the rest of my life. Like I was also a little bit like I'll try it out. Like I'm not sure how much I want to commit to this. And so I joined the feature staff just because at that time I was kind of in between all of the communications majors. And so it felt like a good way to kind of balance my film and TV interests with the journalism interest that I also had. And so I just like ended up really, really liking that section because it, at the Free, it covers a lot of stuff between like writing about food, writing about different student activities, writing about movies, like I mentioned. And so that just like worked out for me, and it ended up being the way that I wanted to approach the entertainment industry versus, being in the actual industry itself. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was just a matter of hearing about it and actually giving it a chance versus, letting other people's opinions inform it.
Yeah, and before we get to the next question, I just want to remind the attendees that you guys can send in questions through the Q&A box throughout the session, and then we can answer them along the way. So you guys know how stressful being a student editor can be, especially like at the Free. I mean, Shivani, as layout editor, you have to stay basically overnight once a week, and obviously as managing editor, Sonia, you had to stay super late every night. So how did you guys kind of balance journalism in college with like your social life, your academic life, things like that?
So for me, layout editor was actually fit into my lifestyle back at college. So I was in other clubs and I would do that other days of the week, but I knew on Wednesdays I had to be at the newsroom, and I made it a game for myself to get out as early as I could. That required a lot of organization. ahead of time, like on Mondays and Tuesdays, I would just dedicate a little bit of time to make sure that I was prepped for Wednesday. I had a team, I'm not remembering how many people, but I would assign them different sections. And so, checking in on them really helped as well. But just knowing what you're capable of is important. I think it is no small responsibility to be on the FREEP staff, but editors are super helpful. And so I could always lean on them if I was feeling stressed or anything like that.
Yeah, I should probably clarify, I did not say what positions I held at the FREEP. So I joined, as I mentioned, the feature staff as a freshman. I don't know if they still have the position, but they had like a film and TV subhead position as well, which I did my second semester, which was kind of just like a glorified liaison position. So I would just kind of like coordinate screenings and whatever for the students at the paper with the publicists from studios and the like. I was features editor fall 2015, which was my sophomore year, and then managing editor the semester after that, and then I joined the board of directors after that. So I had about 2 full years of editorial experience at the Free. In terms of stress, like Shivani said, it is a lot of like planning in advance, I think, kind of, and that comes to like signing up for classes even. So like, I know that for me personally, that my sophomore year when I was an editor twice in a row, I just really made a point of kind of taking the classes that didn't have too much reading, or if I did have one that had too much reading, I would kind of like balance it out with the other ones that were more of like stuff that you would do in class, or just the stuff that didn't require you to have like your face in a book all night, because I mean, after all, we are newspapers, so you're already doing that all night anyways, so you have to give yourself a rest. So I think that in terms of academics, like that kind of thing, making sure you're balancing it and not trying to do too much at once. In terms of social life, thankfully I got along pretty well with the people that I was in the office with all the time, so that worked out well. But at the same time, I think making sure that those aren't the only people you're talking to, because I think going through an editor type of experience, you're there all the time, you're there at weird hours. Like, it is lovely to get along with the people, but at the end of the day, it's like not healthy to only talk to 10 people at college. And so I think really making time for yourself, just not talking to anyone else even, making time to talk to your friends who aren't involved in the same activities that you are, and just like trying to be a person, I think also outside the office is really important. But again, if you do pursue that level of position in a newspaper, it is is a lot. So going in that it'll probably dominate your schedule, but just being aware of when it's doing that too much, and kind of when you need to take a step back when you're not actually in the office itself.
So a lot of our attendees are either involved with their high school or college newspapers. And so what are some of the crucial skills you learned while being a student journalist that you still carry with you at your local and national newspapers?
That's really a hard question. Definitely all the organizational skills I learned being editor, like using apps like Wunderlist. I don't even think that exists anymore, but something, to keep yourself accountable. Let's see, working with editors, I think super underrated skill. You have to know, how to take critique, how to push back a little bit on your editor when it's the right choice. Comes with time. It's not an easy skill. I have to think on the rest though, Sonia, if you want to take over here.
Sure. I mean, I'm like really lucky to get to go after Shivani because she keeps saying things that I didn't think about. But the part about pushing back on your editors, which is a weird thing to bring up first, but I will say that doing that with your peers is a weird experience, because like a lot of times they're your age, maybe they're younger than you, maybe they're only like a year older than you. So it is a weird thing to kind of critique someone who's your own age, not like significantly, younger than you or whatever. But I think because it is like a weird dynamic in college, you really do learn how to do that constructively. So, if there is something in a story that you don't think is right, or think needs to be fixed, college is a great time to kind of learn how to express that and what it is in terms of like from a journalistic perspective, what it is that needs to be changed. So I do think that kind of carrying those communication skills to the professional world has been something that's really valuable for me. Also just in terms of like using college as a time to experiment. I actually wish I did this more, but I think it's a really great opportunity to look at things you're familiar with. You know, we are a campus newspaper, so after all, you're kind of writing about yourself a little bit. And so I think it's a good time to take that comfort that you have, you know, being in a space that you're comfortable with, and just experiment, like try new things, whether it's, you know, different forms of media, whether it's the angles you're writing, whether it's the type of people you're talking to on campus, just really using that to get out of your comfort zone. I think that is something that you can do in college that would, you know, obviously be very helpful later on as well.
Something to follow up on that. Don't be afraid to branch out. So I was layout, but I remember the features editor at the time, like I was obsessed with Harry Potter and I wanted to watch the new movie that was coming out, something Crimes of Grindelwald or whatever. So she let me write the review for it. And I didn't write for the free at that point. I was only doing layout, but it was fun to have that opportunity. And I think even as editor, you know, you can still branch out and learn new things. Never forget that. You can always learn new things, even as you start your professional career as a journalist.
Do you ever feel like you are able to use your skills in InDesign and Photoshop and Illustrator in your career?
Yeah, even outside of journalism, I think that's a tool that, you know, if you're trying to be competitive in multimedia, it's super useful. Even if you're not in layout, I would definitely recommend taking a fundamentals of design class or something like that. Just because those skills, like, you know, designing small graphics, using data to do that sort of thing, maybe that's a little advanced, but creating like a title and designing your resume, like the skills are applicable to so many things. So if I can say anything as the layout editor, I would say please learn Photoshop and learn InDesign, because a lot of newspapers do still use InDesign to put together their papers.
So we have a really interesting question in the Q&A box. It says, this person is not a journalism major and hasn't really been involved in a school paper. So it says, how would you recommend I go about getting started in this space? So they're a STEM major.
I still think, you know, it's kind of like what we did, just approach the free, choose whatever you feel most comfortable with. I had a friend who was a neuroscience major. I think she was a couple years younger than me, and she joined features. And I remember she would write more science-based articles, and she loved it. She still writes blogs and stuff on her own time. She's graduated now. So don't let it stop you that you're not a journalism major.
No, I would say it's actually, if, you know, this person is interested in writing about that subject itself, it could even be more valuable at times. I think, you know, I got lucky in that, like, what I write about is something that I had like a long-standing interest in. So I'm not like, I was not a film major, so I didn't like study that to that extent. But I think it is very, very valuable to have that depth of knowledge in something you're reporting on. And, you know, some people who do go to J school end up picking up that knowledge as they report on the subject. But if you're going in with all that knowledge, that's super valuable. And in this case, you know, if you're in a college setting, again, it goes back to like, this is the time to learn, this is the time to experiment. You can pick up the journalism part of it. You know, if you have that foundation of knowledge, that's what student papers are about. They're about learning. And so I think that I wouldn't be too worried about not having the exact same background as other students at the paper. I think it's super valuable to come at things from a different perspective as well. And yeah, I mean, a lot of professional journalists who did go to J school end up getting graduate degrees in their, you know, subject area. So you're just kind of flipping it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you both mentioned, Shivani, like you work with Photoshop and all of these kind of design applications, even as a reporter. And so for both of you, how important do you think it is to, you know, you both are reporters, how important is it to branch out and still be skilled in photography or producing like audience engagement work and just going outside of just solely like writing reporting?
First of all, I think it keeps things fresh. You know, you're not only doing one thing, you're widening your skill set. So I would recommend always, you know, practicing taking photos and stuff. And I want to say that you don't need a DSLR. Like I used to think that. If you have an iPhone, I know that's a privilege as well, but that um, it suffices. You know, you can take video, you can take photos. I was talking to an editor yesterday who joked that he would wait to announce that he took the front page photo with his iPhone. And, you know, so it's I think important to be the whole package. And I think that's what professors will tell you, that you need to know how to, you know, write, take your own photography, take your own video. I don't necessarily think you need to master every skill, but if you're comfortable with media, I think that goes a long way. And I think editors are willing to work with you there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, you know, you never really know what assignment you're going to be given, depending on, you know, I think the protests that have been going on are a great example of this. A lot of, you know, I haven't been covering them, but a lot of the reporters at the Post who have been covering them have also been, as Shivani mentioned, using their iPhones to shoot videos, shoot photos. And I mean, we have actual photojournalists on the scenes as well. And so while their photos might be, you know, the ones that are more prominently used, sometimes a reporter just happens to be in a place where they have to, they're the only ones documenting what's going on in that specific instance. And so their stuff does get used. And so I think it's just really valuable to be able to, you know, do that without hesitating, be able to, you know, have it as an instinct to kind of just pull out your phone and record something if something's happening in front of you, in addition to, you know, writing it in a notebook or whatever a reporter would usually do. And in terms of, you know, beyond just being the package or like the whole package, I think it's really helpful in terms of working with other people in a newsroom. I think for me, I'm not like a good photographer, but I think that, you know, having a sense of visual literacy is really helpful and important when you're working with photo editors, when you're working with, sometimes I work with photographers, not often, unless I'm like on the scene or something. But you know, just having that eye for things is helpful. And I mean, some of that is just like innate, but some of it is something that you can develop as well. And I think it just makes things go smoother if you kind of have an understanding of what goes into a photo editor's job. I'm not saying you need to be a photo editor, but just understanding where they're coming from. The same goes for design as well. I think if you ever need to work with a designer in the future on like a bigger project or something, it just helps to have an understanding of what they're doing. Because I do think that, you know, a lot of J school, unless you go to like a specialized path, is geared toward reporters just because of how, you know, the programs are set up. But there's so many other parts of journalism as well that deserve to be, you know, taught and understood to that same extent. So, you know, if it's not in the program, I say try to, you know, get that knowledge yourself somehow.
Yeah, so we have another question that actually it asks, is there anything about the journalism industry that you didn't expect? So maybe like what differs from a real world newsroom, like a professional newsroom that's not a college newsroom as compared to college reporting?
It's so much more casual than I thought it would be. I honestly thought I would be wearing like formal clothing to go into the newsroom and that it would be a ton of people. One, newsrooms, especially local newsrooms, and that's primarily where I've worked, are very small. My first job was just the two of us full-time staff. I rarely saw people in the office. But two, there's a lot of camaraderie, you know, like if you can reach out to your coworkers, at least in my experience, and you stand to gain a lot from not only friendship wise, but also just learning their experience at the newspaper. And so it's very much a partnership in that sense. So I'm an education writer, and it's been nice to be on Twitter and to just randomly follow all these other education reporters. It's randomly a very small community. So I follow this one who works in Florida, and she did this template for, you know, remote learning. And so I was like, hey, can I use this? And I used it, got a great response. And so, you know, it's things that I wouldn't have thought of on my own, but I think leaning on that community has been awesome for me. And it's not something I would have thought of back when I was working in the student newsroom. I used to think it was very like, you had to stick to your newsroom and that's who, you know, you lean on, but that's really not the case.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is kind of a scary industry to enter, and we entered it very recently as well. And so I think, you know, it is very competitive in the job market. So I think that kind of gears people up to have that expectation of newsrooms being really like scary and dog eat dog, and like there's these important people who have Pulitzers and you're 20 something and you can't talk to them and whatever. But that's not really the case. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I work in a pretty big newsroom, so I don't know half the people in it, but I think that, you know, if there have been people outside of my immediate, you know, team who I've been interested in speaking to, I've been lucky enough to have really positive experiences in all of those aspects. And people, you know, people always remember where they came from in that type of setting. So when someone, you know, emails them out of the blue and you're like, hey, I'm 23 years old and I'd love to, you know, buy you coffee and pick your brain on something if you have, you know, a moment or whatever. And always buy them the coffee. You are taking their time, so make sure you do that. Don't let them buy it for you. But anyways, I think that, you know, that's a really helpful thing that I didn't really expect. I don't know, I just didn't expect people to be as nice as they tend to be. Not saying that everyone is like that, but again, I've been really lucky in that aspect. I think also just, I don't know, this is kind of a weird thing to say because it is like kind of the reverse, but I also did not expect to be given as much like freedom as I have been at work. I think that's also very, very specific to what your job is. But for me, you know, I got lucky in that I interned at the Post and kind of just never left. So I was like, I had like 3 different jobs in between, but I am on staff now. And, you know, I think building that trust with, you know, 2 editors who I worked with pretty much my entire time there has been really great because I just, like, even though I am a lot younger than a lot of people on my team, like almost by a decade, I think, it's been helpful. I mean, once you get a job somewhere, there's a reason they hire you. And so, you know, a lot of newsrooms are, especially now, more willing to listen to younger reporters, younger editors, if they're, you know, photo editors or the like, designers, everyone. A lot of people are, you know, valuing youth more than they have before. They are valuing different perspectives more than they have before, whether that goes to, you know, race, gender, you know, sexuality, any of that. I think that, you know, it's a gradual change for sure, but I am, you know, I have been pleasantly surprised at times by, you know, how open people are to talking about that too.
Yeah, so as we all know, across newsrooms in America, a lot of positions are being cut and people are taking on more responsibility. And so how do you both deal with burnout and prioritize mental health with, you know, your work being open to scrutiny and just the responsibility you have as a journalist?
So again, I work at a more local newspaper, but I also cover 20 different school districts. And so if I stop to think about that, I feel like it's very overwhelming. And the way that I've done it when prioritizing my stories, you know, like it's with the expectation that, hey, I cannot do this as one person. I cannot cover all the education in Ventura County. So it's what's going to make the most impact. And that, you know, helps calm me down a little bit. And then in terms of my free time, not so much during the weekdays, just because as a journalist, you know, some like in the middle of the day, I have usually a lull and then I'll have meetings later in the day. So that's kind of iffy, but weekends are especially important to me. Like I won't bring my laptop, I won't touch my work phone. And that's because, you know, for better or for worse, it'll wait. Like, especially with my beat, I'm lucky I don't do breaking news, typically speaking. So I know the work will be there on Monday and I can prioritize that Sunday night or something like that. But it is very important to keep your weekends and to make sure that free time is your own. Do not think about work because if you do that, like it's just a bad spiral.
Yeah, I think burnout, I mentioned that I had like 4 different jobs at the Post, so I can just break that down because it's relevant to this, but I interned the summer of 2017. It's pretty recent. I went back to school for 1 semester, graduated, and then I was kind of like a contract worker type thing and also an intern, like on and off for all of 2018, and then I got hired full time. And so I think during that first summer especially, but also, you know, early in the time that I came back, I really felt this like intense need to prove myself just because, again, I was a lot younger than everyone I was working with. But also I think that just happens with interns a lot of the time. You know, people tell you never to say no to an assignment, which I still think is like pretty good advice unless you have like a legitimate reason to say no, in which case say it. But because of that, you know, there is this added pressure of like, well, I need to prove myself. I want to get hired here. I want to, you know, be the best applicant in the hiring process. So I'm just going to do everything I can all the time. And so that's kind of how I was that first summer. And I got a lot of really good clips out of it. But I realized after a while too, that the more you work, the less your brain works. It's crazy how that happens. And so, you know, even if you are working all the time, you can often sense, you know, that the quality of your work has gone down. And that's obviously not something you want to sacrifice, especially if, you know, you're writing something that's going to be online forever, and then you're going to stumble upon it in 10 years and be like, what did I do? And so, you know, I would really value the work that you're doing over the quantity of it. And, you know, the best way to do that is, like she said, to take off weekends. Definitely don't work on weekends if you don't have to. Definitely try not to work outside of the hours. I mean, I'm salaried, I'm not paid hourly. And so for me, you know, even in terms of compensation, there's like no incentive to work after hours, except, you know, if I want to get something done physically. And so I try as much as I can to, you know, really just stop working when my shift is over and when I'm done for the day. I don't really check Slack. I try not to check emails, anything like that. And like my job is kind of breaking news. It is different within, you know, the entertainment sphere, obviously, because breaking news is not the same as it would work if you're like monitoring police scanners or something. But because of that, I've actually found that it is sometimes easier for me to be off the clock because we have like breaking news shifts. So if I'm not on the clock, someone else will pick it up. And it's not really like a continuous thing each day all the time. And so I don't know, I think just talking to your editor too, if you're feeling like the burnout pressure is coming from someone else, which can be the case sometimes, you know, and especially in the type of world we live in right now, we're literally in a pandemic and there's already like 6 other levels of stress added to everyone. So I think having that conversation with your managers is really important. But for me, a lot of the pressure came from within. So I think, you know, having that conversation with other people, but also having it with yourself and just kind of taking a second to figure out what it is that you can handle for the long term rather than, you know, what you can churn out for like a 3-month period.
I want to say work from home is not an excuse to, you know, keep working.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us fell into that trap early on in the pandemic, but it is equally, if not more important, to schedule time for yourself, get out of your bedroom or wherever you work, walk outside. It is so important to keep your sanity, I promise.
Yeah, I'm also really lucky where I don't like live in a studio. So I actually do have separate spaces for work, which by space, I mean, I have a desk in my bedroom. So it is the same space. But like leaving that desk for just work has been really nice because the minute I get up from that chair, like I'm in a different headspace even. So just like if it's a physical thing for you, like don't go to that workstation unless you're in work hours. Some people, it's not just a physical thing, but I don't know, do what you need to do to be able to, I think, separate like your work life and your regular life.
And Sonia, you had a pretty untypical career path where you went like pretty linear straight from an internship to working at the Post, basically. Was that something that you aimed for? Like how exactly did that happen for you?
This is never a helpful answer, which is it just happened. But for me, I mean, I will be completely transparent. I did not have any like connections or whatever in the industry. And I think, I mean, like this isn't really rare for like children of immigrants, I don't think, but like I didn't really know people in the journalism industry and going into college or anything like that. And so I really did just get the job by applying. But I did what I think has become actually relatively common for people who are at the Free or who just go to school in Boston, which is that I went to the Globe and did like, they have a co-op program there. And so I ended up taking off a semester from BU. I was still in Boston, but I worked at the Globe full time. And so I had like an extra linear path almost where I did, you know, I went to the Free, I was at the Globe for about a year because I continued working at the Globe after the co-op program was over. And then I went to the Post. And so I think for me, I mentioned earlier that I kind of had that relationship with one of my editors at the Post that started when I was an intern. And I think that was very helpful for me in kind of making a space for myself to continue working there because I was a features intern. And so similar to the Free at the Post, features covers a lot. It covers you know, we have people who write about politics. Actually, they just write about it from a different perspective. So we have that. We have, you know, we have food. We have a pop culture team, which I'm on. There's now like a wellness section as well. There's like parenting, which I didn't really write about at like 22 years old. But there's a lot of different sections. And as an intern, they kind of encourage you to try everything and work with all of those editors. And so for me, I kind of gravitated towards writing about TV and movies like I do now. And so I would work with that one editor a lot, in addition to, you know, all the other ones I was working with, and kind of built that relationship with her. So they got to know me as, you know, a reporter in terms of kind of where my interests were. And when it came time for me to graduate, luckily I happened to graduate at a time where like everyone was on maternity leave. So I actually came back as a contract worker to fill in for two separate people on maternity leave. But because I had kind of built that relationship ahead of time with my editor and shown them what kind of stories I thought I could write and that they needed to be writing, they were like, oh, well, we can just fit you right into this space in that section. And so I think it was just like a lot of really great timing, and it worked out well for me, you know, based on when I was graduating and when all these people happened to be going on maternity leave. But I think there was a certain element of it that was me saying, you know, if I was lucky enough to work here after my internship, what would I want to be doing and how can I kind of work towards that goal? Right now, when I'm already an intern, I'm already hired, I have nothing to lose. Like, what can I work towards?
And Shivani, how did you get your first job out of college, and how did you end up at the Ventura County Star?
Yeah, so I had a not so linear path in college. So I do want to say one thing I forgot to mention is you should feel free to join the free bet anytime. I was an editor my senior year, and I went before I did that. I just felt like I'm so old compared to the rest of them. But you're getting the same experience. You know, you're still in college, so that's one. But two, when I graduated. Weirdly enough, the one thing that I really wanted was a job without connections. Like I didn't want to get a job solely based on a friend recommending me or a mentor recommending me. Don't ask me why. It was just very much a sticking point for me. So when I looked out, it was literally just me on journalism jobs, like, you know, applying for these jobs. And I found a very, very small newspaper out in Malibu. Lucky for me though, because I got to cover the Woolsey fire. I got to cover like the shooting that happened nearby. I have so much experience, and I don't think I would have gotten that experience had I worked at, say, the LA Times or something like that. I will say, you know, it's also a privilege to be able to work at those newspapers because they don't pay a lot. To be completely transparent, I had to have a second job, so I worked at a cafe during that time. And I will say, you know, unfortunately, it is sometimes a choice you have to make. Journalism salaries aren't where we want them to be, especially at that level. But I will say, I'm a huge advocate for local news. I think I'm just in love with the idea of directly communicating with the community and seeing what types of stories that they want, and bringing that back to them, you know. So I forgot what the question was, but I don't know, just like talking about my experience outside of BU. Yeah, so I wasn't even sure if I wanted to go into journalism right after graduating college, and it just happened. I lucked out in getting this job. And because of the freedom, I think Sonia was talking about that earlier, the freedom that I was granted in that position, I was able to kind of figure out what I liked. And that's where I realized, oh, I like education. So I started doing more stories like that, learning, you know, what does a school board do? What does a budget mean? And that led to this new job that I have as an education reporter. So again, if you're able to, I think it is very competitive at a national level to work at bigger newspapers. So I would say, look to your local community newspapers. A lot of them often take interns, unpaid, unfortunately, but you know, if you can build that repertoire and push for that salary or some sort of stipend, I would go for it. I think it's an invaluable experience.
Yeah, so a new question that came in kind of directly ties to what you were saying, Shivani, about how this question is, how do journalists get paid? Is it for each piece they create or by hour? And it'd be great if you could talk about, both of your experiences, like you were talking about as an intern and like now as a professional.
Yeah, so outside of BU, between the two jobs that I've had, it's both been salaried. So I'm paid bi-weekly and I have that. I'm okay with really being fully transparent about my salary. So the first time around, I think I negotiated one raise, but that was kind of the ceiling, partly the reason why I left. But it was, I think, 28,000, something like that per year. Now I'm a little closer to 40,000. And so that comes with experience, right? So I think typically for a local newspaper, especially a smaller one, it's going to be closer to 25,000 to 30,000, and then you start going up as you get to bigger newspapers. The thing is, you want to look at health benefits. I didn't get any benefits during my first job. I was lucky enough that I was on my parents' plan where I didn't have to think about it so much. But if you're not, then that's something you need to consider when you're applying to these jobs. My newer job, it's within Gannett, which is a bigger media company. So I'm able to get those health benefits and the 401k and that sort of thing. So that's, wrapped up into my salary as well. But
Yeah.
I'm not paid by articles, sorry.
Yeah, that's more of a freelance thing, getting paid by the article, which would mean that you're not on staff at the organization. I also have always been salaried. The Post internship pays, which, by the way, they actually just opened the application for next summer today. So if anyone's interested, they're taking a leap of faith and just, I guess, hoping that we'll be able to be back in the office by then. But if you're interested in it, they're open. I would highly recommend. Obviously, I did it twice. But I've been salaried always. I was salaried then, which, like Shivani, I get paid every other week. I was salaried as a contractor and also in my current job. The one thing I will say, working at the organization I work at, is that we have a really, really great union, and the Post has a union that kind of works within like the DC Baltimore Guild as well. But because of that, they have base salaries that they were able to negotiate for different positions in the newsroom. So I think the reporter base salary was like 55K for the Post. It's obviously a much larger organization. And I made right above that. Like I tried to negotiate, not successfully, I will add, when I got hired at first. But because, the Guild had done that work for me already, they'd done the legwork. I was lucky enough to have a salary I could live on right off the bat. And so, yeah, I get paid every other week. I am actually, I'm also young enough to be on my parents' insurance still. But I know the Post has two different plans you can be on. And a lot of organizations have different options like that. They have different dental plans. They have different things like that. Different, retirement funds and things you can contribute to. So if you're lucky enough to work in an organization like that, I think that is also, really important to negotiate. Like Shivani said, make sure you're not just looking at the number, your salary number, also look at everything else and what else they can offer you. But a lot of that is, done on an institutional level. And so I would say really, I really advocate for getting involved in a union if your organization has one. They're the ones that are, negotiating every year for better 401k matches. They're, we're all very young, but they are advocating for, different amounts of parental leave. I know that our union successfully did that last year, and it's so much better than it used to be. And so, yeah, I think just, really joining that is really important. And I know a lot of young journalists maybe hesitate at first because in order to be part of a union, you do have to pay dues. So there is a percentage of your salary that does not go to your bank account, but goes to, the Guild instead. But, the things that type of organization, the things that they advocate for are just so beneficial. And in the end, you'll be really glad that you contributed that amount of money. So, in addition to advocating for yourself, make sure I'm not saying you should, but it is helpful to, get involved with others in your building as well.
Yeah, so Kimmy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think I was going to ask, the next thing I was going to ask is, as student leaders in whether it's a student newsroom or a professional newsroom, what advice do you have for those leaders to cultivate a space where people can be open about, like Shivani said, you had to work another job because some of the internships were unpaid, and in a lot of student positions, newsrooms don't pay those students. And so how can students cultivate an environment where people can be open about being working at the student newsroom, but also having to manage a job?
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of different with the FREEP, I think. For example, my job, I fit it into my schedule at BU. I worked in the COM alumni office. So I would go during the day on like Tuesdays or Wednesdays or something. And then I always kept FREEP time separate. I understand that's not always possible. So if you're a reporter, it might be different, in which like Sonia might be able to answer a little more to that. But block off days where you work. Again, that comes down to scheduling though, and being transparent with your editor or your team if you're working with that, and just say, hey, like I'm gonna be, off the clock this time. If you need to contact XYZ. And I think that goes a long way in one, establishing that you are thinking ahead, but two, it also gives you a plan for what you're gonna do.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to answer a question in the chat. It's not in the Q&A. The thing that's open that I mentioned was the post-internship program, the Washington Post internship program. And it's eligible, or you are eligible if you are this fall going to be a junior, senior, or grad student. So you can easily Googleable, find that online. In terms of what you were saying, I think that it is really important, I think, to, if you know going in what your schedule is going to be like outside of working at the paper, and you have, a job that does seem to be kind of time consuming at the paper, I think talking to the people you're going to be working with directly is so important, just to do that first, the minute you start the job, so everyone can kind of, set the expectations of how things are going to be. And you can, again, set those expectations for yourself as well, and just make sure you're taking on what you can handle. In terms of leadership, making sure that people feel comfortable with everything that they can take on. I think I probably did not do this enough at the FREEP as well, but just saying things is helpful. We take for granted, I think, a lot of the time that people understand where you're coming from, but sometimes people need to hear things just for it to really register. So I think, if you end up having a leadership position at a paper, maybe just at your pitch meetings, or if you're, higher up, if you're like managing or whatever, like with your editor staff, just letting them know early on, saying, hey, if you ever have any problems, if you ever feel like you're taking on too much, come talk to me, and making sure that people know that your door is open, metaphorically or physically, and that they can come talk to you if they feel like that's something they need to do. Because again, we're doing this for ourselves at the end of the day. Like, college journalism is a way for you to be a better journalist. It's also a way to serve the campus as well. So at the end of the day, you don't want to be like killing yourself over it if it's supposed to be benefiting you and others. So I think, making sure, I was lucky enough where I did have a campus job, but it wasn't like my sole source of income. Like, my parents did help support me throughout college. So my job wasn't like a full-time type job. I had like, I think I had like 8 to 10 hours a week. So it really wasn't that much at all. But because I was, only working that many hours, I kind of blocked it between classes. So I was able to kind of balance it that way, and during the day versus, in the hours I would be in the office. But again, I know not everyone is like that. And some people do need to work more, especially if they're part of a work study program. So yeah, I think just opening that line of communication really early on. I'm hoping that people, would be receptive to that and still want you to write for the newspaper, and still want to hear what you have to say. And I think that, again, newspapers, college level and, professional, are often filled with very privileged people who have, the ability to kind of take a risk and go into this really scary field. And because of that, we don't have a lot of people that come from different backgrounds economically. I'm not saying that's like unilaterally true. There are a lot of people who come from different economic backgrounds, but on the whole, it does lean, probably upper middle class and above. And so I would say it's almost even more important to make space for students who, have to work other jobs, who are in work study programs, who don't fit that typical mold of like, I went to an Ivy League and now I work at the New York Times. Like, I think making space for people to hone their skills early on in college is so important, because those are the people that are going to, end up bringing their perspective to the professional space as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think ever since the protest about Black Lives Matter, there's been many outspoken people in large newspapers and publications like the New York Times, Bon Appetit, the Los Angeles Times, about their newsrooms not necessarily representing the people they serve. And so for these student journalists who are in position of leadership, what is something tangible they can do to make sure they are representing and making those underrepresented voices heard in their coverage?
I've seen a lot of good pieces from student newsrooms about that online. But from my experience and just what I've been seeing, taking a look internally, seeing your group of editors, what's the breakdown between gender, race, and when I remember, like, not to knock on the Freep, but when I was at the Freep, there were no Black students as far as I remember. And that's something to consider, right? Like, why were there no Black students? I know COM is kind of notorious for that. So it's making Freep seem open. And I'm just using Freep as an example because I was part of that, but it's applicable across all student and professional newsrooms, and seeing, if you don't have the diversity, why is that? Is it because your coverage skews towards a certain type of student? And if it does, then how can you change that to reflect a more full-bodied coverage? And I think it goes back to what I was talking about, community reporting, where, what kind of sources are you talking to? And I think it's important to note that you shouldn't just be reporting out events. You want to make sure that you're really digging into the community and seeing, what is affecting Black students. And if you find that out, who is the right person to tell that story? Because I honestly believe that, how do I say this? People of color, I think, really bring a different perspective to the newsroom and can often explain stories, especially well, I think, because given their personal experiences. So I think it's important to have that perspective in the newsroom. I know, and it's not just going out finding like an Indian kid or a Black and being like, be part of our newsroom. It's not that. It's, advocating for them and really pushing to make Freep seem more inclusive. And I think that will result in more students coming into the fold that you wouldn't have necessarily seen even 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely on a much smaller scale in college, but a lot of it does come down to like recruitment practices. So in terms of a college newspaper, like, on the professional level, that could mean like where they're putting these job notices, whether it's like if they're sharing it with NABJ or like AJ and all those like journalistic organizations that, cater toward non-white journalists, or, in college, if it is a matter of, editors or even, other reporters going to like student organizations that aren't, as represented by the Freep staff. There are a lot, especially I think college is very well geared towards like cultural organizations. So, going to organizations that aren't journalism oriented, but are more identity oriented maybe. And kind of, this goes back to, us talking about the STEM thing, writing about something versus being a writer, then going toward the subject area, if that makes sense. Just because someone is a different major doesn't mean they can't write about what they're interested in. So if you go to, these student organizations and let them know that they have the opportunity to report on something that they might have expressed interest in because they're already a part of that group, I think that's a really great way to kind of get at that. And I think I mentioned earlier something about just saying things versus just assuming people know. And I know someone I work with, not personally, she's on our graphics team, but she, fought really hard for the post hiring like notices that go out publicly to have, language in there about looking for diverse candidates in the application pools. And that was something that, if you're applying, it's not necessarily going to stop you from applying. I think it only, language like that only makes people feel like they're being heard early on. And so, just a matter of like expressing that you have an interest in maybe diversifying your newsroom and then going out and acting on that in terms of how you try to find people to hire for your newsroom is really important. I think just things need to be communicated more, I think, than they have been in the past. So kind of doing that. And I also think talking to people who are already on staff, because of course it's a college newspaper, so people come back year after year. I think talking to people about that, maybe in pitch meetings, everyone has like friends that they know as friends, but maybe they could also know as potential colleagues at the paper. So, kind of just seeing if they know people whose perspectives they really admire and who they think have something to say. Kind of, just having people open their minds to the fact that, there could be more people in the newsroom than just the like 20 kids in your fundamentals of journalism class.
Yeah, and we have a question from earlier in the chat that says, how do you deal with personal bias in your writing? So have you guys ever had to cover something that you had a personal passion for or against, and how does that play into the way you cover it?
I think that's a really big topic in journalism right now because I think it ties into objectivity. I will be honest, I don't believe in the old guard of you have to be straight as an arrow, completely objective. One, I don't think that's possible. Two, I think we're stronger writers when we, use our experience to inform our writing. But I want to be very clear when I say that accuracy is important, and I don't necessarily think, objectivity and accuracy are two different things. I want to make sure, that I am passionate about kids. It's why I'm writing about it. I believe in their success, but I don't think that necessarily means that I'm going to be touting, oh, the school district's doing this and it's great. No, my job is to keep them accountable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm not still passionate about kids. I would say that it's because of my passion for education that I am doing stronger reporting. In terms of like, bias and objectivity, I encourage you to read what's out there, and I encourage you to check Twitter. I think it's just very interesting to see how reporters use their social media to leverage, ideas. I don't necessarily think that, both sidism I don't think is a thing. First of all, I think you have the responsibility to report on what angles there are. But for example, scientific-based evidence, if one thing is wrong, one thing is right, and that's fact. Stick to facts, stick to accuracy, and I don't think it will lead you astray. So that's all I will say on that.
I definitely agree with what she said. He can say it better than I ever could. I would definitely recommend looking up Wes Lowry's op-ed in the New York Times that circulated, I think, last month. I don't know, time doesn't even feel like a thing anymore. But he wrote this, in response to kind of this conversation that she talked about is being had throughout the industry. And, basically the thesis statement of that is the same thing, which is that, objectivity used to be like, well, if you talk to this person, you have to talk to the person on the opposing side of the conflict as well. And I think, I don't remember if it's in this op-ed or just in the conversations that have been being had, but there is a really strong tradition in crime journalism, especially, of, taking police reports at face value, but then not trusting reports from, a victim or a victim's family the same way. And so, the concept of objectivity has already been kind of like a thing that's not real in journalism. So I think, it's more so a matter of interrogating what it is that you think personal bias means. And at the end of the day, like Shivani said, as long as everything in your story is factually accurate and you have, people who can actually speak to what they're talking about, whether, you know, they were there on the scene or they're actually knowledgeable about what they're talking about. I think it's more about making sure that everything is accurate, everything is factual, everything is, you know, backed up by some sort of, you know, expertise to whatever you're talking about. That seems more important to me than kind of like making sure you're weighing two sides, because not, like she said, not every issue, you know, racism doesn't really have two sides. There's just the good thing of not being racist. So like, I think it is more about, yeah, facts. But yeah, definitely read Wes Lowry's op-ed because it was really great.
Yeah, and another attendee also asked, speaking of Twitter, how do you guys engage with social media as a journalist without losing your mind?
I spend too much time on Twitter for sure. But I also I love following like pop culture journalists like Sonia, and I love, you know, following other education reporters and that sort of thing. I think it's an invaluable source. To be honest, because I started this job work from home, this is where I find sources. A lot of teachers are on Twitter, surprisingly. In terms of my own feed, like I'll like stupid pop culture stuff. Not that it's stupid, Sonia, you know what I mean.
I will say that my feed is stupid.
But,
so many of you guys go there.
yeah, but you know, because we grew up in a time where, you know, Twitter became this big thing, and I think I am in the middle of like millennial and Gen Z, so I think it's fine to have a personality on Twitter, you know. I do think I draw the line at what's it called, outright supporting people on education stances or something like that if it's not factually correct, because I like that's kind of a conflict with my beat. And I would expect the same for a politics reporter, right? Like I would expect them not to like go Kamala or something like that, you know. I wouldn't expect them to do that. And so in that sense, you have to weigh, again, personal biases and how you want to be perceived on Twitter, because honestly, trolls and like bad actors, they will look at your social media. And so you have to make sure you're comfortable with that. For me, I'm comfortable liking humorous tweets. I retweet it all the time. They're not always reporters, and that's fine with me. It's like a mix of education and also that sort of thing. So it's to each their own, really.
Yeah, and I would say I think our generation has the added benefit of being, like she said, we are digital natives, so we understand platforms a lot more than, you know, some of the people making social media policies at organizations do, which has been an ongoing conversation at our place as well. But you know, my feed is pretty dumb because I have a lot of it is pop culture. I do not comment on politics personally, just because of, you know, where I work and the fact that I might have to cover it one day. Who knows? I don't really express stances on that type of stuff, like policies or anything of the sort. But, you know, I think Twitter is valuable. I do find a lot of people to talk to on there. But I think the one thing that's really, really important to remember is that it's like such a small percentage of the people out there. And so I think, you know, especially with culture journalism, there is this inclination that if like people are talking about it on Twitter, that it's like a thing. But honestly, like it's really not half the time. Like it's kind of just people feeding on each other. So a lot of Twitter is, you know, just journalists talking to each other. But then there's a whole nother thing, which is like actual people that you can talk to for a story. Someone said Stan Twitter is the best. Like there are actually, I mean, we saw like K-pop stans actually having influence on real world events outside of Twitter. So I think, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but it is definitely, I think, good to have an understanding of social media platforms and kind of the communities that are on there.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to us and answer all of the attendees' questions. I think you both provided some real insight in how the industry, not just with student newsrooms, but professional newsrooms, are grappling with diversity and making sure everyone is represented, the communities are being represented. So thank you so much. And Angela, if you have any other announcements.
Thank you guys so much. Your answers were really helpful, and thank you to the attendees for participating. So we can end it here, I guess.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you. And if you guys have any other questions, I mean, my name is on the little screen, so you can email or tweet or whatever. I'm happy to answer.
Same here.
You guys.
Do you want us to put our contact information here? Or I don't know if that's...
Yeah, if you're comfortable, and I mean, I'm sure the attendees will appreciate it if you want to put your emails, if they want to reach out to you guys or anything.
Sure, I'm just going to type it in the chat.
Okay.
I hope this was helpful. Y'all are going into a good time in journalism. There's no shortage of stories, and I just can't say enough.
All right.
All right, good luck with everything.